working on this scene yesterday. It's a little forest scene generated entirely within Sverchok. So every one of these trees, rocks, bushes, shrubs, the ground itself is all generated by Sverchok, and the distribution is able to change according to a seed value which I put in. Rather than giving myself the challenge of making a full workflow tutorial, which would take 6 or 7 hours to go through the full thing with explanations, I'm just going to do a time lapse here. So generating the ground initially, that's just a plane with subdivisions, and I've used 2 different noise displaces, one kind of like a higher frequency, and one lower, to give me the 2 different kind of scales of variation. And then the second thing I'm working on is the rocks. So to begin with, I used the rock gen add-on which comes with Blender, and I just generated a certain number of rocks, and then I'm positioning them with Sverchok. But I decided that actually I wanted to be able to control the number of rocks as well, and just have more of a kind of ongoing fine control. Ended up changing this out, so I'm just using a box node, putting it through a subdivide which I'm having some fractal variation on, and then also using 2 noise displaces. This is actually a very similar process to what the rock gen add-on does. Then I'm using a random points on mesh from the ground plane, and this is allowing me to iterate the rocks over the surface of the plane using loops. Then I'm outputting through a mesh viewer, and I'm setting this to merge, so it creates one object, and then I'm just putting a voxel remesh, like the remesh node, remesh modifier on that mesh output. So to generate the trees, all I've done is I've created a line segment with a number of cuts in it, and then used a randomize to give them a little bit of a wiggle. This is going through a skin mesher node to give me the output, and that lets me set a radius kind of difference bottom and top. To get the distribution, I'm doing the same things I did before, so just random points on a mesh and use that to loop and position the trees. So what you can see me doing here is I am just trying to avoid tree rock intersections by calculating the distance between things. I think what I ended up doing was I went with a merge by distance. So I joined the 2 sets of vertices that create the positions, and I merge at a certain distance, and then I remove the tree set. So this it basically takes away any rock which gets too close to the bottom. For the most part it works. It's not completely foolproof, but it does kind of a quick and dirty approach. So I had a bit of an issue with the skin mesher actually here, because I wanted to bring the tree trunks back into the node tree and add some noise displacement to the surface, but the skin mesher doesn't let you target a collection, and it doesn't have its own object output either, so I couldn't. I tried putting the trees into a collection manually, but then the skin mesher couldn't reach it, and it was creating all sorts of issues, so I abandoned that and I did it with shaders later on. So the next thing I'm working on is creating the bushes. So I am creating random points on mesh, and I'm selecting a certain number of those. I think I went for 3 or 4. And those ones I'm also creating, like duplicating the point up above to create like a double tiered bush. So to create the actual points inside the bush, instead of using a particle system, what I'm using is an icosphere, which I've displaced. And then you're using a bounding box node to create the size of a vector point field, a vector p field node, and this lets me create points with randomness. And I'm just working out points inside mesh, allows me to find which points are inside that icosphere. To generate the leaves that will go on all of those points, I'm just using an n-gon node. This lets me set a kind of a low poly shape with randomness immediately. And it also has a seed, so I can change, for every leaf I can change the seed. I'm also adding a random vector to my axis angle so that I can rotate each leaf in a unique way. And then all I do is I loop this through, so I've got the bushes being looped to generate them on the points on the mesh, the icospheres that is. I'm taking the verts out of those, like the points which are inside them, and I'm using those positions to loop the leaf generation, and that's letting me generate all the different leaves, and I can say each time I'm using a for each flag, which lets me generate each. So I have a certain number of inputs, right? So like 1,000 leaf positions. And if I say for each, then it's going to run this loop for every one of those vertex inputs. So for each of those, I can change the seed on the leaf shape. And I can also pick a random number of these to have outlines, which I've just taken the vertices through to a polyline node. And this is outputting the outline of the leaf. So I did this because I didn't want to use freestyle. I wanted everything just to be completely live in viewport. So I'm just using Fresnel and creating these manual lines that I can then put a non-emissive, or sorry, an emissive black texture on. Generating the grasses, I wanted these kind of bunches of grass, kind of cartoon style. And I just generated some curves. So I've got my initial points at the bottom that are generated from an n-gon node. And then I've got my higher points, which I'm generating with a helix node. And I'm doing this so that I can make those center ones taller. So that's my start and end point. And then I'm basically just saying my tangent is straight up. So they bend out from the middle. The next challenge for me was to work out how to actually get the kind of the profile of the leaf. I went with a bevel or curve node, which is actually really useful. It lets me set a bevel and a taper. And just for both of these, I used segment nodes. Just so that I had something simple, just a nice straight taper and a flat 2D card for the actual leaf itself. I did have some problems when I started looping this because I'm actually still not sure quite why it didn't work, but it was giving me this error that there was vector subtraction that was not allowed on the arc start end tangent. And you can see in the viewport there it's output 1 blade of grass per position as well. So I ended up changing the way that I was doing the leaves. So you can see here I'm like trying to work out a different way of doing these leaves. So what I went with in the end was just a 3-point curve, 3-point arc, which just lets you set a start, mid and end point. So my start and my mid point, they were the same, just the mid was a bit higher. So it still had that vertical curve outwards to those final positions. I wanted to add leaves to the outside of the trunks like ivy. So I just generated pipes that followed the same path as the trees itself. And then I used those pipes just using square section one, so super low computation, really nice and easy to compute those. And then random points on those meshes, and then adding that to the leaf positions. Because I'm adding it to the end of the list, I'm also able to say if the loop number is above, I think in this case it was like 3,200, but I just pulled the loop, I just pulled the list length off the bushes. So if it was greater than the number of leaves that were in the bushes, then I could say that it was one that was on the tree, and then I could change the size and also the rotation. I wanted to add a little bit turf, so I selected any points which were above a certain height, I think just 0 on the ground plane, any points in that, and then I extruded those regions up, so that gave me the turf section. And I also did a bisect to pull the leaves, the ivy leaves, down to like 5 feet or something, so a little bit more manageable. So I've got the whole bulk of the actual computational system designed, and I'm starting to work in shaders now. So I wanted this kind of sort of cell shaded, kind of watercolory, impressionist, lots of touches of kind of dots and dabs and things. So just using Voronoi, and I've actually used 2D Voronoi here, even though it's a 3D scene, just so I can sort of project it through an angle which mirrors more or less the sun angle. And on the roof I've got a Shadowcaster, which I have just put in, so I've set it to alpha clip, and I've just put a Voronoi on there so that it's casting this Voronoi kind of dappled shade look. I put the colour in a group, so I'm using a color ramp to set my colours from dark through to light to go from kind of this bluey purple indigo colour all the way up through green, yellow into white. And I put that into a group so that I am consistent throughout the shaders, and if I need to change that in one, it'll change in all of them. Coming through, I'm just duplicating these materials for the most part because I want to get the same feel for each of them. I want to get that same kind of dabby look, but I also want them to be slightly different colours. So for example, the grass on the turf there, that's a much greener colour. And I've also added a Fresnel outline. So you can see that where we're getting those, sort of almost like grass anyway, you're getting the Fresnel around the outside. I've also added the non-emissive, or like the black emissive, to the polylines, the ones that go around the leaves, just to give me that kind of slightly scrawly, hand-drawn look on the edge of those leaf patterns. Again, using Fresnel to throw the colour, like the shadow colour, that dark blue, into the bottom of the grasses and bushes. The ground is again the same, so just using the Voronoi, but in a much kind of warmer colour. And also the rocks I put in a kind of mid-green orange look, a little bit khaki. So I need to make sure that the ivy was actually on the outside of the tree trunks after I made the tree trunks a bit bigger. And just generally working out proportions of things, like how many outlines do we want, what size are the trees, how many trees. Working out some things with the bushes and just generally colour stuff. So working from the bottom up using a gradient in the Z-axis, and that lets me set a little bit more shadow lower down. I decided that I wanted to have a few more lines in the grasses, so I used a polyline viewer on the grass as well. Now what you can see is I've taken a paper node group that I've made before, and I'm using, I will be using window coordinates, so it's always in line with the camera. And this basically just means that I never have any issue with the texture changing as it curves around an object. It's always going to be uniform across every object in the entire scene. There's not going to be any break in this texture, so it's always going to feel like it's kind of 2D. It's going to make everything feel a bit more 2D. I thought the background was standing out a little bit too much, so I wanted to make sure that the darker section had some kind of hints towards bushes. So I just wanted to grab another Z-axis and burn that onto a Voronoi, just to give me that lower down section. So these last few, I just took 30 renders from 30 different seeds.